We are in Mark chapter 4. If you are using the blue Bibles that we have laying around here or in the pew in front of you, we're on page 1558. If you are following along, there are sermon outlines at the end of each row. If you are a note taker, there's going to be a time of reflection at the end, allow you to write down questions that you have. We're going to do this in 3 parts today, beginning in verse 26. Jesus is teaching his followers in parables. These are small stories that are meant to ask them the question, are you sure? That's what the parables do. They ask, are you sure? So we begin in verse 26. He also said, this is what the kingdom of God is like. A man scatters seed on the ground. Night and day, whether he sleeps or gets up, the seed sprouts and grows, though he does not know how. All by itself, the soil produces grain. First the stalk, then the head, then the full kernel in the head. As soon as the grain is ripe, he puts the sickle to it, because the harvest has come. I am fascinated with several things that Jesus did when he was teaching, whether it's his disciples or the crowd, or whether he was confronting the religious officials of his day. One of the things that amazes me the most is that he never uses analogies of technology or war. It's a really interesting teaching style because Jesus could have easily said, I'll tell you what the kingdom of heaven is like. It's like a catapult in which you load truth and then you fire it at your enemy, right? He could have easily have said that, and yet he didn't. He never said stuff like that. He talked about birds and widows and bread rising and crops. It's fascinating. Because God's work in the world is the most natural thing in the world. When Jesus talks about this dream that he has, we might call it a poem. When he is in the mode of being a poet and he's dreaming of how the world could be a different way, or he's telling us about God's work in the world, he doesn't use mechanism and technology and war. He uses nature. And it's interesting because I often find that when I am talking to other people of faith, or maybe people who have moved on from faith, and they ask me about what I believe or how can I still believe with, everything that we know or whatever. And we're talking about what is contained in this little unexploded bomb called, the word we use is God, the G-O-D, which, as we've been talking about, is really just, it's a word blanket that we lay over the mystery to give it shape, right? Now, some people take that God thing and they project it up on the sky so that you have a big human up there somewhere. And that human sort of likes everybody that you like and hates everybody you hate, right? And we personify, right, that God. It becomes a person. And that person is strangely like us or like we'd like to be, right? And so I just want to point out that Jesus, he rarely does something like that. More what he talks about is the way that, the natural way, the way that nature is in the world. And I think there's something to be learned from that, especially for us in a scientific age, in a technological age, that there is something beautiful about being rooted and grounded, still connected to this amazing planet that is, whether you call it, there's something inspired about it, or whether you use the word enchanted, or whether you say awe, we are in awe of how the universe works. There is something beautiful about embracing the fact that we're not alone in the world. But for those of us who believe in a divine presence, by whatever name we call her, by whatever attributes we attend to, whether we masculine or feminine, the divine, the important thing is to realize that God's work in the world is the most natural thing in the world. Believing in God is the most natural thing in the world. And that's why you don't have to always build yourself up to take the leap of faith, right? That sometimes we've made it too complicated and too elaborate. And sometimes it's the most simple, most natural, most straightforward thing is to acknowledge I'm not alone in the world. There is more going on than I can explain or diagram or measure or even attend to. That there is a mystery about life, the miracle of life. And so as Jesus says this, my favorite part of this story is, last week he talked about this farmer who sowed seed so recklessly that it ended up on a pathway, like the concrete. It was on the sidewalk. It was outside the bounds of the field. It got into the thorn bushes, right? He just sowed the seed so recklessly. And I just love that picture of God just broadcasting the message of love everywhere, whether it is well received or not, whether it is invited or not. Just that message just goes out and it bears fruit in its own way. Well, in the same way, I love this analogy of the farmer, that the farmer sows seed, and then whether the farmer does anything else at all, the seed knows what to do. And I love this idea that God is at work in the world, whether you and I have initiated it, or are conducting it, or are facilitating it, or following up on it, that God is just the divine. Let's say the divine, the eternal, is at work everywhere, whether you do anything or not. And this is where Bishop Desmond Tutu comes in. He had a saying that I love. I'm going to paraphrase. He said, without God, we can't. Without us, God won't. There is something beautiful about the partnership between a farmer and her land. That the land receives the work that is done and bears fruit. But like this, it's not always up to the farmer. My wife's a gardener. I'm understating that. If you spelled gardener with a capital G and then yelled, gardener, that's beginning, she's really into it. Like all caps, this woman, I have a sign that says, I love CJ like CJ loves plants. This woman loves plants. Can't get enough of them. Always buying more, putting them in the ground. She divides them in half. She uses the seeds. She loves these things. And apparently there was this flower that she was suspicious was going to come up this week. She knows her garden, and she was looking for it, and she couldn't wait for it. She checked in the morning, nothing. That evening, we walk outside before dinner, and she wants to show me, because she's so excited. She thinks they're about to burst through. Not only had they come up, they're about 4 inches tall and already have flowers. By that evening, she had turned her back for a couple hours, and the plant had just emerged from the soil and was putting on a show. And she wasn't that happy about it. It was like, for all the anticipation, and the plant just had a mind of its own, and apparently didn't know that she was, waiting for it. It didn't do her any favors to be on her timeline. But because I knew we were looking at this passage this week, I sort of enjoyed it. Because she sowed the seed, but wasn't in charge of anything else. The temperature of the soil, the sun, right? Everything else. And that plant has a life of its own. And it lives that life whether you're there to tend it or not. There's something beautiful about that. And this is what Jesus says God's work in the world is like. For me, as a gardener of souls, or a spiritual gardener, or however you want to say it, I just love this grace that we don't have to do everything. Now, It's a symbiotic relationship, right? It's a partnership. And God has invited us in, the divine, the eternal, however you want to say it, has invited us to be a part of this beautiful process of making love known in the world. What an invitation. We call it the Great Commission, co-mission. That without God, we can't, and without us, God won't. But that God is at work everywhere, at all times, and we get to partner in that, the cultivating of goodness in the world. It's fantastic. So let's go on to verse 30. Jesus says, again, what shall we say the kingdom of heaven is like? Or what parable shall we use to describe it? It's like a mustard seed, which is the smallest seed you plant in the ground, yet when planted, it grows and becomes the largest of all the garden plants, with such big branches that the birds of the air can perch in its shade. Now, with many similar parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as much as they could understand. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. But when he was alone with his own disciples, he explained everything. Excuse me. There's two things in here that I find really fascinating. I'm going to add a third. The easiest one is we love teaching stories like this to children, right? Like we give them this tiny little mustard seeds, and then we say like, you know, and then this tiny thing, an unexpected thing, can grow into something great, right? And even give shelter to the birds of the air, right? They can perch in its branches because it's strong. And we make the analogy of faith. It's like, this is like your faith, right? It only takes like a mustard seed. You just have a little bit of faith, and it can grow into this beautiful thing in which other living beings can rest and find shelter, right? And that Sunday school version of this story is beautiful. I love it. Unfortunately, my friend ruined it for me a couple years ago. His name's Pete, and he pointed out that everywhere else in the gospel, birds are bad. Every story Jesus ever tells, the birds are working for the bad guy. They are agents of evil. Like in last week's story, Jesus scatters the seed, and the birds come and steal it away, right? Nowhere else in the Gospels are birds seen as a good thing. So Pete's theory is that what Jesus is saying here is that this little seed of the gospel, this little group of 12 that he's cultivating, will someday become the institutionalized church in which evil can hide and find rest. Thanks, Pete. Pete comes from a Catholic background, and so he uses the analogy that when, the Christian church, especially in the Catholic context, became so large that predatory priests could be hidden in its various parishes, that was a fulfillment of this kind of a thing that Jesus... Now, I don't think that's what Jesus was saying, just so you know. I just think that Pete had a clever turn on it by pointing out that birds are bad in every other parable in the Gospels. But here's the thing that I like the most about it, is that Jesus, it says, didn't say anything without using a parable. And then later he would explain it to his remedial disciples. By the way, even as we go through the rest of this gospel, they never really got it. So that's something worth noting. And sometimes we feel superior to them because, these guys are bumbling fools. And in hindsight, 2020, we understand perfectly well, as if we would have understood Jesus speaking in his riddles and using these little stories and parables. But the interesting thing, which is going to become important in the coming weeks, is that there are some scholars. One of them is named John Dominic Crossan. He's a really interesting Jesus scholar. And this group has a theory that I've become quite fond of, which is that Jesus taught his disciples in parables, and his disciples told us about Jesus using parables. So this parabolic style of communicating, that Jesus used stories to teach his disciples, and his disciples picked up on the pattern, and then they used stories to tell us about Jesus. Okay? That gets us to verse 35. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with them. The furious squall came up and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Be quiet, be still." Then the wind died down and was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." I'll never forget one day when I lived in upstate New York, I loved fishing. I fished any chance I got. And there was a summer heat wave where the fish stopped biting, and it was really frustrating. And then we found out that there was a storm front moving through. And if you know anything about fishing big lakes, fish often will feed heavily before a storm because the water's going to get churned up and they're going to go down. And so they will have a feeding frenzy as a front moves through right before a storm hits. So I called my buddy and I said, "Play hooky from work this afternoon. Let's go fishing and see if this theory is true." So him and I cut work, and we went out in the afternoon in our 2 canoes, and we were fishing, and we were catching so many fish. We were having so much fun. And as the dark line of clouds kept getting closer and closer, we didn't want to stop fishing because we were doing so well. And so we stayed out on the water a little too long. And as we saw that line of rain enter the shore, we knew that we had waited too long. So we pulled up our lines, we secured them, and we started paddling towards the marina where we had put in. But that storm closed in on us, and that first wave was like 6 or 8 feet, the first wave, and it tipped both of our canoes over instantly. And now we're hanging on the side of our canoes as the waves get bigger and bigger, and the storm, finally, it did calm down, and as you know, I eventually make it to shore, which is the good part of the story. But I will never forget that. And whenever I read a passage like this, I know that we were just on a small lake, right, relatively compared to this body of water that they were on. I can only imagine how terrifying, especially at night, it would have been to be caught up in that kind of a storm. You can perfectly understand the disciples being quite disgruntled that their terror level is up here and Jesus's is down here. The reason I bring this up is we as Methodists have a story like this. John Wesley from England was sent to Georgia, the American colony. He was supposed to be a missionary to the Native Americans, and it went terribly. And he was headed back across the Atlantic in a boat, and a storm came up. And he was terrified for his very life. But at the other end of they were below deck, at the other end of the room, there was a group of spiritualists. They were called Moravians. They were a peace-loving, anti-government branch of Christianity who believed in the internal light, the presence of God's Spirit within. And they calmly just stood at the other end and sang hymns and prayed. And he saw the gap between his anxiety level and their calmness. And it impacted his life so deeply that as he wandered around England upon his return from Georgia, as he wandered around England, knowing that he was missing something, one evening he hears one of these songs and goes into the Aldersgate Cathedral and is greeted by God's presence in such a powerful way that he famously said his heart was strangely warmed. And he became who we now know as John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. But it was in a storm like this where the gap between his anxiety and the calmness being displayed was so evident it exposed his lack of faith. So you can understand Jesus' disciples being this terrified. So, Jesus, in our story, calmly gets up, tells the wind to settle down, tells the waves to be still. The storm passes, and he turns to his disciples and says, "Where's your faith? Why are you so afraid?" Now, I have no interest in debating you in the science or the physics of calming storms by telling them to be quiet. I know that that makes the news sometimes when there's a hurricane headed towards a place that parties too much, like New Orleans or something like that. I have no interest in this debate at all. Here's what I want to do. I want to hear the word of the Lord. If Jesus' disciples are telling us a story, like Jesus told them stories, I want to hear what they're trying to tell me. And what the point I think that they're trying to tell us here is, when everything is chaos around you, when the storms are crashing in, when you are afraid, maybe even for your very life, that is the moment of faith. Be not afraid is one of the most powerful phrases in the Bible. Because you can be faced with overwhelming circumstances and darkness and terrifying storms. Maybe even be afraid for your own personal well-being, your safety. And it's at that moment, that's the moment where the partnership between our heart and the divine presence in the world is available. Too often, Christianity and sometimes other religions have celebrated glory. We love Easter, right? We love overcoming. We love victory. But I think the point that we're supposed to get out of this story is it's actually at that moment when you're afraid the boat is going to come apart and you're going to be up to your neck or even over your head with this situation. It's in that exact moment that faith is available, that hope comes to you. I heard a sermon on this passage one time that has always stuck with me. And he kept saying this funny phrase. He said, in the storms of life, it turns out that hope was asleep at the back of the boat. And I've never forgotten that phrase. And sometimes when life is not treating me very well, or I don't like how it's going, or my circumstances have overwhelmed me, or the darkness is intimidating me with my anxiety and depression, it's in those moments that silly phrase from that preacher all those years ago keeps coming back to me, that maybe it's at that moment that hope is asleep at the back of the boat. Dumb stuff like that, man. But in these stories that Jesus' disciples, who he taught using stories, in these stories that they passed down to us, they're trying to convey something to us. And so I want to hear, what is it that they're trying to say to us? I don't want to debate physics. I want to hear the word of the Lord. And the word of the Lord for us as a people is be not afraid. No matter what life is throwing your way, what season of life you find yourself in, whether you like how things are going or don't like how things are going, that these moments are moments calling for hope and calling for faith. I'm going to be quiet for a minute. If you have anything that's rattling around in your brain or something that has jumped up in your heart, there's a section here. You can write your questions. If you want me to follow. Wasn't that the perfect song to end this on? Oh, I loved it. I want to bless you as we head into Easter week. I hope to see you Wednesday night for the dinner, Friday night for the Tenebrae service, Sunday morning for the sunrise service, and then back here for Easter celebration. But I want to bless you as we go our separate ways. You are a living being of great worth. And the divine's activity is all around you, whether you are aware of it or tuned into it or not. So I bless you. May you have eyes to see and ears to hear and a heart of willingness to partner with this divine presence in the world. I pray that you would be surprised by something this week, that somebody would initiate a conversation with you, or a circumstance would arise that allows you to be the person of grace and the person of faith that you are called to be. I bless you. In Christ's name, amen. We are dispersed.